Well, I think it's really interesting just to tie all this up to relate it to our teaching is that obviously you have these profound experiences, these marker events that we move from stage to stage as our personality develops and we need to learn new ways to do things. I love the idea of knowing your kids in your class. You're probably going to only know them up to the grade level you're teaching, but to modify it somehow to learn about them. How long have you lived here? How many brothers and sisters do you have? Do you have grandparents that live with you? Just thinking about, these kids today have grown up with, what was this, the 18th shooting in Orlando? I mean, that has an impact on their life, their safety, their security. How do they process that? So just to be sensitive to the child you once were and to the people that you're doing ministry with, I think is important. So let's just take a little quick tour of some development. To teach catechesis, obviously we have to know the content of what we're teaching. It doesn't mean we have to be theologians. We're journeying with people. Just a lot of you had the OCI experience, so you were someone journeyed with you. That I don't know why, but I never felt in all my years of religious education, I always had permission to say, that is an awesome question. I wish I knew the answer to that question, and we're going to find out. And how cool that we have Google and internet and can find out quicker than we used to. So they're not looking for theologians, but obviously, basic knowledge of what we're teaching, and that's provided in our teacher manuals. And the lovely word of the week that I send you every week. Scripture, people of the Word, praying the Word, knowing the Word, hearing the Word, living the Word, attending liturgy, have some understanding of that, being engaged in the sacramental life, that we should lead a good moral life, we should be people of prayer, and know the church teachings and live them, and then finally, familiarity with the process of how do people learn. So it's great, we've all had teachers who were brilliant but couldn't teach you at all, right? Okay, so we want to have some familiarity with that process. What are the elements of structured catechesis and understanding the person to be catechized? So fortunately, our textbooks frame all that structure of catechesis, that especially at Transfiguration, we do have systematic catechesis that by the time the kids get through 12th grade, we've given them a good understanding of who we are as Catholics, what we believe, why we believe it, and then to continue lifelong faith formation as adults. So understanding the person to be catechized, whether it's a little one or an adult. Educational psychology is really that big umbrella for all of the things that come under how people go through different stages, whether it's human development, learning theory, motivation, discipline. Developmental psychology is that psychology that has stages associated with it. So we're going to take a look at a couple of developmental psychology, but I think it's good just to look at the age group below what you're teaching and the age group that you are teaching and the age group above, so that you can kind of see what's normal. And I think just as a quick summary, preschool is very concrete. If you tell them something, they believe you. They learn by touching, the senses, right? So I like this because it kind of looked at all of the whole person, whether it's spiritual, mental, physical, emotional. Grades K to 3, they're still pretty concrete thinkers. A lot of activity, moving around a lot. They used to say, and this has changed too for all of my teacher friends, but it used to be in K to 3, you learn to read. And then from grades 4 on, you read to learn. Where now kids are coming to kindergarten as readers, That is just amazing. But that's like a huge gift when you start working with kids that are readers, and independent learning is awesome. And they're probably in grades 4 to 6, like they talk about the age of joining. It's when kids, join a lot of sports teams, scouts. So you capitalize that in the classroom as, having different groups. To a lot of competition they like in those grades. Grades 7 through 8 are kind of all over the place. The girls are ahead of the boys. They're taller in their development, and they're looking at the boys like, what planet did you fall from? And then you kind of see, it's funny because it says high energy level. I'll say it's high energy level when it's something they're engaged in, but for the most part, I think lethargy is also a good term. Their bodies are changing quickly and they need a lot of sleep. And then it talks about the high school years and just how that self-image changes, you know, that they kind of work through that. Who am I? Identity crisis, friends become so important. And then I think to speak to what Chrissy was saying, 16 to 20, it's really that focus on the future, forming a love relationship and having intimate relationships. And then early adulthood is when people are engaging in their careers and permanent relationships, childbearing, middle age. We're going to talk a little bit about more of these, and then later maturity and all the changes that go with that. But keep that, and I'm going to skip ahead because we just kind of glance through those. So really the developmental theorists that we're going to talk about, and they're in here, are Erik Erikson, Lawrence Kohlberg, and Jean Piaget. How many of you have heard of those men before? See? Okay. So Erikson is famous for his 8 stages of man. And he says that the way we move is we have to resolve this crisis in each one of these stages. So what's interesting is when you parallel this to faith development, which it's amazing how, I just remember being like, wow, that's so awesome. So birth to 1 year is really the foundation of our faith, right? That kids have to learn trust. So how do they learn trust? How does a baby learn trust? Brittany.
Take care of them.
What happens when he cries?
You do something about it.
Right. So that they learn to say the world is a safe place. There are people that love me that can later say God loves me, right? Autonomy versus shame is that self-control, I can do it myself, right? Limit setting, initiative versus guilt is, again, I can do things by myself. I can take responsibility for things. Through mastery is learning successfully. Through middle school and into high school, that identity versus role confusion. Who am I? 18 to 24 is intimacy versus isolation, the ability to form relationships. 24 to 60, I guess, like, because that's where I am, is that generativity versus stagnation, that my life has been life-giving, that there's been a purpose to it. And then finally, the 60s, ego integrity, that you can look back on your life and say, it was good, you know, or despair. So that's kind of Erikson in a very quick view. And so that's Erikson, just so that the big thing to remember about Erikson is don't remember all those 8 stages, but that it's a conflict that helps us to grow and to move to a new stage. Learning theory, how do we learn? So if I asked you, Alan, how do you learn? What would you say? What's your best way to learn?
Visual.
Okay, you like to see it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, anybody else?
Do it.
Do it? Yeah. Okay. Some people it's hearing, some people it's a combination, right? So the main 3 school names of thought about learning, how people acquire learning, is cognitive, which is your brain, information processing. Okay, and that's Jean Piaget that's how we learn, it's processed through our brain. The behaviorist, you all remember B.S. Skinner, right? And what was it, the dogs? Pavlov's dogs. I was saying Maslow, but he's self-actualization. Pavlov's dog. So it's behavioral learning is that you can measure learning. It's an observable change in behavior is behavioral learning. So in the way that behaviorists do it is I reward you if you do something well, and I remove the reward if you do something undesirable. And then humanism is Myra's favorite. There's a little map in here. Unconditional positive regard, that learning has to be meaningful, and that I have to be in a relationship with you, Mark, for you to learn something from me. Okay? So there's a little triad here that for humanism, it's here's humanism. Okay, so it's this triangle, and it's all congruent, that there's unconditional positive regard, and that we are facilitators. So I think when you look at all 3 of those, probably except for the really purists, that we use all 3 of those strategies when we're teaching to encourage learning, as well as the auditory, the visual, the tactile, and we'll go back to that. So let's look at Piaget. He says, and this is interesting now because it goes with Erikson in the 8 stages of man as well. So he says birth to age 2 is learning by senses, expression through action. right? So my young moms here, crawling, tasting, touching, right? That we learn through our senses. Pre-operational is, again, that concrete images, so that you think about when we were teaching kids math, remember buttons and abacuses, and it's all things you can touch, right? So it's all concrete. And in ages 7 to 11, they start to be able to distinguish fantasy from reality, but it's still mostly concrete. And it's not till they're 11 that they can really start to think abstractly, which is really interesting when you think about when we're teaching kids about God. You know, so we teach them like all those Bible stories, right? And then when they get older, we teach them that a lot of those are parables from the Old Testament about to understand God's love. So it's just interesting to me about that. Okay, so Kohlberg then is another cognitive theorist, a developmental theorist, and what is morality? Definition, morality. The ability to, you guys saw the screen, come on, because I went back. Okay, morality, what is morality? How do we make decisions? Right or wrong? Truth, right? Morality. So in our faith, when we teach morality, we say it's about forming a conscience so that you can decide right from wrong. It's about our relationship with God. That as Catholics, our moral basis is scriptures, the Ten Commandments, the magisterium, the teachings of the church. So response to grace, it's God's life within us. That's how we make our choices. I wish I hadn't done this, sorry. It's grace-centered. Okay, I guess that's it. So morality is that really forming a conscience and how we make choices, right? Kohlberg, so the big criticism of Kohlberg's theory is it was an all-male sample, and I think it was Carol Gilligan was a woman that challenged it, and she included females in her sample later on, but pretty much the findings were the same. So all human people, it doesn't matter. But what's interesting is he says that the early stages of decision making are fear of punishment. You do the right thing so you don't have to be in timeout, right? But it's also, when you look back at Erickson, learning to set limits and have self-control. And then reciprocity. If it's good for me, and I'll do it. If you do this for me, I'll do this for you. This is how we make choices. Conventional is desire for approval. I want you to like me, so I'm going to do the right thing. I want that bonus, so I'm going to do the right thing. Maybe. Law and order, he says 75% of us make decisions at this law and order reasoning. That it's, and it's not a bad thing. We have a speed limit, right? 55. If you go 55, everybody will be safe if you follow the law. So it keeps order for the community. Then this higher level thinking is, or moral reasoning is, commitment to the common good and living from consciousness of universal values. So even though you make decisions, even though it may be against the law, but you know that it's the right thing to do. So I kind of would think of people like conscientious objectors, you know, where you're willing to take the consequences, people that protest and could go to jail, but they believe that what they're doing, so they're willing to take the consequence of not the order, but they have to do the things. Or I think of people like Dorothy Day, you know, somebody that started a Catholic worker movement to take care of the poor. That it's just a higher level of reasoning with the responsibility that goes with it. Jesus, I mean, would you consider him a rebel? You know, so I hope to be there someday, but it's a work in progress. Kohlberg also says that the best way to develop our conscience is a lot of what ifs, like hypothetical statements, you know. So I'm sure you all remember, if a poor man stole a loaf of bread, is it wrong, right? Yeah. But just working with kids, what would you do if, helps them to develop moral reasoning. Knowing what's the right thing to do doesn't always guarantee that you will do the right thing. So I'm sure nobody here has ever experienced speed limit, right? That's the easy one. That's the easy one. But I think it is, but that's part of living our faith, right? Living the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it is challenging and it is long decision making every day. Pass a homeless person on the street. What do? You know, and there's not, well, the right answer is be Jesus to them. But how do you do that? So every day we have those encounters to live our faith. We talked about all that, behaviorism, good. Howard Gardner, he is a person who says everyone is smart. That, and this is Myra's talk that she's out of the Catechist Day. So he has this theory of multiple intelligences. The really cool thing is that for like up through 12th grade anyway, you know, the people that publish these textbooks have educational psychologists and developmental, and they incorporate all this. So for those of us who have been teaching for a long time, now there's a multiple intelligence activity in your lesson. So that if you have somebody who learns by maps, they have that opportunity to do that. But I think it is really cool because he says that we are all smart. We're just smart in different ways. So as catechists, as people who are walking with people in faith, we need to find out what is their learning style and adapt our lesson accordingly. So he says some people are word smart, some people are music smart, some people are number smart, picture smart, body smart, people smart, self smart, nature smart. So I think that resonates with everybody because you look at yourself. You know, Alan said, I'm a visual learner. So you're picture smart. You like to see things. You know, that works best for you. So Fowler, what he says is that first stage of faith, which is usually the basic trust of infancy, is learning to trust that the caregivers in the world are reliable. And then we can extend that as a foundation for the other stages. The next stage is 3 to 7-year-olds, and that's the faith of imitation. And so children reflect the faith of their parents or their caregivers. So have you ever seen that in church where the child looks over at Miss Carla and Miss Carla's like this and the child is like this? You know, so they imitate what we do. And that's a way that they begin to learn about faith, is the stories that we tell them and by how important it is to us. The next is about 7 through 12, and it's the faith of joining. And that is where you begin to internalize faith attitudes and views of person, and it's still mostly affected by the adults in your life. 12 to 18 is synthetic conventional, and it's the faith of trusted adults, and that's usually the early teens. So it's also affected by their peer group, you know, so that's why I think relationships are so important in really any age, but I guess you see it mostly with the teenagers, you know, that is positive peer pressure. Conforming to the norm becomes increasingly important and may continue into adulthood, where a relationship with church determines their faith security. So I read an article too that said some people, even though they say it's really like that 12 to 18, some people are just stay in that stage their whole life. You know, that if, just depending on what you do, how deep do you dig to know more about God and your faith, right? So you kind of think about, without judgment, the Christmas and Easter people, you know, that they're here for those times and we welcome them, but we wish they would come back the next Sunday and next Sunday, right? 18 to 40 is the faith of one's own. So it's really when you begin to question faith assumptions but make peace with them. So I think it's really cool, like the people that have come through the OCI, this is really where you guys almost entered, you know, the Catholic faith, because you chose it. So it's a neat faith journey. And then the faith of commitment is the 40 plus. Usually discover a meaningful reconciliation of the things that maybe troubled you earlier in your journey, in your relationship with God. Person usually moves beyond the views of others into their own expression of faith. And he says that last universalizing is very rare, and it's those people who live so attuned to the ultimate meaning of life that their faith expression is beyond all self-interest, exposing a culmination of growth in faith brought about by human fidelity aided by grace. So I think I like Mother Teresa. But it's interesting because even though I say that, you know, a lot of you have heard her story of like her years of darkness, right? Where she didn't feel God's presence. So most of the kids, that we are teaching are up through here, and then as if you're working with adults, you're in that older stage. And again, the way you move is something happens in your life to cause you to want to look at things differently. I always like to share the story of 20 years ago, I was teaching 9th grade, and it was very interesting. So they would have been like 14-year-olds, and my co-teacher was probably more like in that faith of trusted authorities in some areas, but we were having this discussion with the kids. It was about the liturgical year and how we celebrate Christmas in December, and that really, as they've done more and more research, they're thinking really Jesus' birth was probably more in the spring equinox time, about the stage of the sheep, and she was like, no, it's wrong, December 25th. And I'm like, and this is my co-teacher, but does it really matter? Isn't the important part that God sent the Savior to the world to redeem us? Yes, but it was December 25th. So it was just really interesting because the kids kind of divided. We ended up with this debate where half of them were like, it has to be December 25th, and then the other half of us are like, well, if your birthday was on a Friday, did you sometimes celebrate it on the weekend? Trying to convince them to move beyond, to create this conflict. And most of them were just, it was a riot. But you read this and you think about these moments where they counter that, The other point is too, you can never frustrate somebody. They say you can only challenge a stage ahead. So my analogy to that is if you took a 5-year-old, you could not teach them multiplication until they knew addition, because multiplication is repeated addition. So if you try to go too far, people just shut down, can't process, nope, not happening. So it's good to be aware. A lot of you have taught 9th grade too, and it's a Jesuit priest that wrote the book that we use in 9th grade, but I think it's the 2nd chapter. And he gives the kids permission to ask questions as 9th graders, that he says there's this theory of faith in 3 stages. So he says there's childhood faith, which is whatever you were raised in, and then you have transitional faith, which is probably what happens right here, where you ask questions, you're like, how could God allow this to happen to the people of the Old Testament? Right? And you have to wrestle with that. And then you come out with an adult's convicted faith. So it's a journey in those 3 stages. But I think it's really cool to give those high school kids permission to say, if it doesn't make sense, ask about it. Talk about it. That's how you're growing. That's God's invitation to say, come to know me more. Ask, Goldman's thing was that he consulted with theologians and educational psychologists to come up with his theories, stages of faith. So basically he says that first stage is 5 to 7-year-olds, and it's just intuitive, which is kind of really cool because it's just that pure faith. I mean, Myra is your break kids. Myra works with the kids with disabilities, and you ever want to see Jesus, listen to them. It's not complicated, it's not cluttered, it's just that pure God is love, faith, in our heart. And as we get older, we kind of mess with that. He says a lot of this, again, is tied to, he's more like the Piaget, because you can see where it's that concrete operational, that it's got to be things we can touch and manipulate to understand it. So 7 to 9 years old, he calls this sub-religious. He says the other thing is religious faith development is slower than other stages of development because so much of it is based on experience and language. So he says they also can't make good conclusions in the 7 to 9 years old. So he will set, the example that he gave was, you say, why is the ground holy? Because God blessed it. Why did God bless it? Because it was holy. So it's just like the circular, you've probably seen that with your little 2nd grade last year where they can't follow the logic of it. But it is, I think, of the heart. And then 9 to 12-year-olds, which would be about 4th through about 6th grade, is when they really start to have religious thinking, that they want to know the stories of our faith, they want to make decisions. Still pretty literal, that it's hard to abstract everything from it. that we can do as we're older. And then finally, that last religious 13 and up is religious thinking becomes capable of abstract and operational thought. We can think hypothetically and deductively, abstractly, symbolically, which so much of our faith is all those symbols, right? But a lot of them they can touch, so that resonates or is meaningful to the people who are concrete. They say with the little kids, if you want to teach about God's love, like let them go out in nature and what do you see that God created today, or the pet a monkey, and all those things. I think the best thing, like I said, the takeaway is to know that people go through these stages to have just a very brief familiarity with what they are, because it adapts your teaching to it. To talk to the kids, to find out their stories of where they've come from, what has impacted their life to become the people that they are so far at that stage, and then to tailor our teaching to that.